There are plenty of games that seemed impossible to improve on, only for the later titles to blow them out of the water. But on occasion, gaming developers managed to whip out a masterpiece right on the first try. And not only that, the follow-ups were unable to recreate the magic, forcing them to forever remain in their original shadow. Regardless of how bad or well these particular franchises turned out, there's no doubt the initial installment is the best of the bunch. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video game franchises that never topped the original. Number 10. Serious Sam. Around the millennium, shooters like Halo, Deus Ex, and Half-Life began focusing more on story, strategy, and completing objectives, rather than charging around boomsticks blazing. Despite the major shift in the genre, Crow Team stuck with their guns, literally, releasing an old-school blaster in 2001 called Serious Sam: The First Encounter. With its over-the-top action and snarky humor, Serious Sam felt like a love letter to classic dun-toters like Doom and Duke Nukem 3D. It offered an awesome challenge, action-oriented gameplay, and testosterone-filled battles. It didn't reinvent the wheel, but Serious Sam offered oodles of fun. Sadly, the bombastic Fragfest is a franchise that just got worse and worse. The second encounter is simply more of the same. Serious Sam 2, which is the third entry, was too cartoony and lacked the edgy bite of its predecessors. Then Serious Sam 3 BFE's closed environments and lack of puzzles presented a terribly tedious experience. At this point, Crow Team should have known how to avoid the pitfalls of the lesser sequels and ensure the next installment was a return to form. Alas, Serious Sam 4 is so lacking in creativity that it's baffling why the developers bothered with it in the first place. Number 9. Crackdown. Failures seem imminent for Crackdown, considering it came out immediately after the highly anticipated Halo 3. Fortunately, critics were won over by almost everything real-time world sci-fi shooter had to offer. Hell, if Crackdown could be classified as a superhero IP, it's up there with the best. Despite being an early Xbox 360 standout though, there was admittedly room for improvement, and it seemed certain that a sequel would take things to the next level. Taking the underdeveloped story and brief campaign mode into account, these flaws could be fixed in the sequels and create something truly special, a real rival to Halo and Gears. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. Crackdown 2 should have been called Crackdown again, since it's the same game with a few infuriating features and mechanics tacked on. As for Crackdown 3, it perfectly encapsulates the phrase, "What the heck happened here?" It's so derivative of its predecessors. It's bizarre the developers thought this travesty was worth bringing Crackdown out of its 12-year hiatus. If someone played the third entry with no prior knowledge of the franchise, they'd probably find it difficult to believe anybody was excited for it. Number 8. The Walking Dead. Telltale has fallen on hard times recently, undergoing major restructuring, game cancellations, and studio closures. For this reason, it's easy to forget how impactful Telltale's The Walking Dead was. Players are compelled to make difficult choices, deciding what to do, who to kill, and who to spare, which drastically affects the plot and the survivors' relationships. The Walking Dead isn't just a brilliant game, but a beautiful story thanks to the tight script, soul-stirring soundtrack, and powerful performances. The bond between the leads, Lee and Clementine, is so flawlessly structured, it's impossible not to become invested. After The Walking Dead, and I think maybe we can be so bold in saying single-handedly reignited the adventure genre, at least in this format, it wasn't a surprise when it generated a DLC, a spin-off, and 3 sequels. Since the first installment was lightning in a bottle, it seemed impossible for the following entries to recapture it, and sadly, that was exactly what happened. Although the follow-ups remain focused on tough choices and character conflicts and are definitely good in their own right, they just didn't have the emotional intensity as the one that started it all. The later games are definitely worth checking out, but players shouldn't expect the same experience as that first outing. Number 7. Dead Rising. Not content with cornering the zombie market with Resident Evil, Capcom developed another undead franchise in 2006 called Dead Rising. The open-world title separates itself from other undead titles as it focuses on being entertaining rather than scary. The eccentric characters and countless methods to dispose of brain-dead flesh-eaters are so hilarious, people who don't normally gravitate towards zombie stories should have a ball playing this, especially if you just played Telltale's The Walking Dead. While future installments would lose the tight balance between horror and comedy, the original Dead Rising doesn't rely on its wackiness, since it's still a demanding game that offers a diverse range of combat, imaginative objectives, and challenging escort missions. But since Dead Rising is renowned for its quirky comedy, the sequels cranked the zaniness up to 11. And sadly, that decision caused the developers to neglect its basic components, which led to weak stories, performance issues, and rampant glitches. Sure, the follow-ups have some gut-bustingly funny moments, but that doesn't excuse the underwhelming gameplay. Also, the DLC for the last 2 installments is so bare bones, it's clear that they were tossed out just to make a quick buck. Though Dead Rising is still incredibly successful, it could have been better if the later titles focused on the same values as the original. Number 6. Deus Ex. The initial buzz for Deus Ex wasn't great, considering it was spearheaded by the guys behind Daikatana. That's why it was so jarring when the futuristic RPG obliterated the most anticipated games upon its release. Not only is Deus Ex a tremendous title, it offers a ton of replayability, since players can go down alternate paths, complete objectives in various ways, discover different dialogue trees, and unlock multiple endings. Ion Storm's IP was so scorching, fans didn't just want more, they needed more. However, gamers tried to have realistic expectations for the sequel so they could avoid disappointment. With the benefit of hindsight, expectations for Deus Ex Invisible War should have been dramatically lower. Despite some solid voice work and a quality story, it was nothing to write home about. As promising as the next entry looked, skepticism was warranted after how the last one turned out. Luckily, Deus Ex Human Revolution offered players everything they could have asked for. Every aspect of this installment, from the interwoven storylines to the dynamic gameplay, was so highly praised, it reignited interest in the series. If the 4th outing could maintain the same pace, the Cyberpunk title could become a juggernaut of a franchise once more. Though Deus Ex Mankind Divided is solid, it fell short due to the abrupt story, as well as the surprisingly shallow writing and the inclusion of microtransactions. Although it was refreshing to see the beloved IP make a comeback, it's yet to surpass the original. Number 5. Banjo-Kazooie. Banjo-Kazooie may not have been the Mario beta that some were anticipating, but it did surpass Nintendo's biggest IP at the time in certain ways. Not only did Rare's cutesy platformer have superior camera controls, graphics, and music remixing, players didn't have to restart levels every time they obtained a collectible. After the Bird and Bear duo became a hit, Rare released a sequel 2 years later. Though Banjo-Tooie was praised for its vast levels and clever puzzles, it didn't meet expectations due to the excessive backtracking and constant frame rate drops. Also, the power-ups weren't as creative since most of them were simply variations of eggs. Worst of all, the Stop and Swap feature, which was intended to connect the first 2 games together, was completely abandoned. Excluding this feature felt like a betrayal since it was Banjo-Tooie's biggest selling point. Then there's Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Okay, let's try to be fair. Even though this threequel is infamous for focusing more on driving than run and jump gameplay, the vehicle sections are surprisingly fun. Nevertheless, it's still mind-boggling why the developers decided to give the platforming a backseat, given it was the bread and butter of the franchise. Nuts and Bolts isn't as bad as its reputation, but it definitely pales in comparison to what came before. Number 4. Golden Sun. Like the best turn-based games, this Game Boy Advance title has a sprawling story, a cast of well-written characters, a beautifully structured map, a gorgeous soundtrack, and a slew of epic bosses. However, what makes Golden Sun stand out is its Djinn system. By collecting Djinn creatures hidden around the map, our protagonist can equip them to his teammates to improve their HP, strength, and magic techniques. Not only that, our heroes can use the Djinn to summon powerful monsters in battle. As good as the sequels are, they didn't have the same wow factor. Golden Sun: The Lost Age takes too long for the 2 central plotlines to merge together, and there's the constant backtracking and lengthy puzzles, so patience is inevitably worn thin. Also, the fact that players have to transfer data from the first game using a ridiculous password system to get the full experience created an absolute nightmare. Though Golden Sun Dark Dawn looks magnificent and is surprisingly accessible for players unfamiliar with the previous games, it's way too easy. Players can breeze through the biggest battles without having any understanding of the complex combat system, and that's just a shame. Number 3. Metroid Prime. Looking back, it's hard to believe Metroid Prime endured any pessimism. Since the previous games were 2D side-scrolling platformers, it seemed unwise to turn Prime into a first-person shooter. Also, the project was being developed by Retro Studios, a subsidiary of Nintendo who had never made a video game before. After half the developers were fired, including the CEO, it looked like this Metroid title was primed for failure. Against the odds, Metroid Prime was a triumph, collecting almost every gaming award that year. Due to the tense atmosphere, innovative gameplay, immersive soundtrack, sensational boss battles, and focus on exploration, Prime is borderline faultless, arguably beating Super Metroid as the best in the series. Although expectations were through the roof for the sequels, they actually improved on certain factors. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes minimized backtracking and allowed fast travel to make the exploration less tedious. Metroid Prime 3 Corruption had a more diverse range of bosses, and it put more emphasis on fleshing out the characters. Still, as fantastic as the follow-ups turned out, they didn't have the same level of awe that the original did. Even though the current Metroid trilogy is tremendous, the first installment is still top dog. Number 2. BioShock. The instant 2K unleashed BioShock on the world, the gaming community knew they were witnessing something remarkable. Thanks to the top-of-the-line graphics, solid gameplay, and fluid controls, the Atlas Shrugged-inspired shooter was always going to be a hit. But what elevates BioShock is how it goes above and beyond in every other department, offering a palpable atmosphere, breathtaking world-building, powerful performances, morally conflicting choices, and a thought-provoking plot. After receiving unanimous acclaim, a sequel was all but inevitable. Unfortunately, BioShock 2 utterly lacked the complexity of the original. Although the Big Daddy is the franchise's defining character, having him serve as the protagonist this time around felt like misplaced fan service. Fortunately, BioShock Infinite course-corrected, giving players another intricate and heart-wrenching story that captured the spirit of the original without imitating it. Now, there are a few issues here and there, including the convoluted narrative and some repetitive enemy battles. And also, the boss fight with Lady Comstock is infuriating. Of course, none of these quibbles stop BioShock Infinite from being a truly momentous title that will absolutely stand the test of time. Having said that, the original BioShock is still the big daddy of the series. Number 1. Knights of the Old Republic. Knights of the Old Republic, my favorite RPG of all time, yes, I will mention it every single time it pops up in a video, is arguably the best thing to stem from George Lucas's sci-fi saga. Wow, I didn't write that part. That is controversial. Well, let's keep going. Since the prequel takes place millennia in the past, the game isn't shackled by Star Wars lore, allowing the plot to be explored in ways never seen before. Despite boasting an immense story, a large array of characters, a vast galaxy to explore, KOTOR is surprisingly accessible from the get-go. And thanks to the stellar writing focus on character conflicts and that twist, it's easy to see why Knights of the Old Republic is regarded as the best Star Wars game. When a sequel was greenlit, nobody was the least bit surprised. However, it was a bad move to release KOTOR to the Sith Lords 1 year after the first installment. This follow-up was so rushed, it's obvious that an entire chunk was left on the cutting room floor. The battle system was barely fine-tuned, the story isn't as interesting, and none of the characters are particularly compelling. Darth Nihilus is deeply underwritten even by Star Wars standards. However, fans were hoping that the next entry, The Old Republic, would redeem the franchise, since the MMORPG was the most expensive video game ever made at the time. Considering Tor earned 1 million subscribers in 3 days and has spawned 8 DLCs over the last decade, there's no question this spin-off has been a consistent success. As fun as The Old Republic is, though, it never matches the original in terms of story or character development. As such, there's no doubt the Force is definitely strongest with the first Knights of the Old Republic.